economic victories, or is it just his inexperience?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, you know, it's laughable. You've got a guy over there, you've got a leader of the opposition who had to hire a consultant to figure out how to operate his own office. You know, I mean, you know, the biggest budget he's ever had to manage, Mr. Speaker. The simple fact of the matter is that the whole world has gone through recession.
Order, please. The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the simple fact of the matter is that the whole world is going through recessionary pressures. You see what's happening in the United States. You see the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. And what's happening here in Nova Scotia is, in fact, for most people, what they see is progress being made in their economy. Since June of 2009, what we've seen is a steady string of announcements around new jobs that are coming into the province. We've won the largest industrial contract in the history of our province, Mr. Speaker, and you see even now the Statistics Canada reporting that there are 8,800 more jobs in the province than there was when we came to power.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in his first answer, he was celebrating all the good things going on in the economy of Nova Scotia. In his second answer, he was blaming all the bad things going on in the economy of Nova Scotia on someone else, Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Premier said, and I quote, "Job growth is going in the right direction," end of quote. So the Premier's content with more part-time work, more low-paid work, and fewer full-time jobs. The Premier seems pleased that he watched 6 corporations lay off more than 1,300 Nova Scotians after taking $590 million out of the pockets of the taxpayers of this Scotia with the help of our Premier. Nova Scotians are working twice as hard because this government has a habit of writing big checks to big business, and the Premier seems to be content with Nova Scotians being laid off. So my question to the Premier, why is this government forcing Nova Scotians into part-time work, and why does the Premier think that's going in the right direction?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know if the Leader of the Opposition really thinks that what he's saying is believed by anyone, because it's not. I mean, people understand, maybe by the few people that sat behind him, but the reality is that, you know, there was $300 million invested in order to win 10,000 jobs, Mr. Speaker. A commercial loan advanced at a commercial rate that can only be forgiven if they actually hit the job targets, Mr. Speaker. In addition, that will generate more than $2 billion in tax revenues. If the Leader of the Opposition can't see the virtue of that equation, then that is inexperience writ large.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking of jobs, under the NDP, Nova Scotia has become an expensive national playground for those that are seeking to set new precedents in our country under their new labour laws like first contract arbitration. Yesterday, we learned that even our amateur hockey players are not safe from this new trend, Mr. Speaker, as we learned that the Cape Breton Screaming Eagles have received an application from a national union to organize, and I will table the statement from the Screaming Eagles when they indicate that they received an application from the Canadian Hockey League Players Association seeking to certify our children amateur hockey players under their union. I'll table that for the benefit of the House. Mr. Speaker, fact of the matter is that it is the fans, the hockey families and the fans of Nova Scotia that will pay the price for this expensive new national playground that the NDP have set up for union drives. My question to the Premier, will he now concede that he has created an expensive national playground for new union drives and his hockey families that are going to end up paying the price.
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I always love when the contrast between the opposition parties is so distinct. Just not more than 30 seconds ago, I was the friend of big business, and now I'm the friend of big labor, Mr. Speaker. The truth of the matter is, we are just the champions. We are just the champions of the people, Mr. Speaker. That's the only people we work for. Mr. Speaker, perhaps the leader of the Conservative Party would have a look at the actual facts, and he would discover that the organizing drive for the CHLPA actually began in Alberta, that bastion of union democracy.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier may be wondering who his friends are, but I can assure this House is certainly not a friend of the thousands of Nova Scotians who are out looking for work, who don't get a bailout from his government, but do get a hockey stick in the rear end when they're faced with these kinds of pro-union labour laws. But, Mr. Speaker, in case the government doesn't think this is a serious issue, in case the Premier doesn't think this is a serious issue, it's not only about hockey. It's not only about the expense that our hockey fans will have to take. It is actually about all of those companies out there seeking to employ a few Nova Scotians here, because they too are under the gun. Companies like Egg Films, for example, a Nova Scotia success story, a small business treating their employees well, who themselves were subject to a national union, in this case the IATSE union, coming to town because they believe Nova Scotia is now the place to go if you want to attack companies like Egg Films. In fact, their president, Sarah Thomas, says, and I quote, that this national union bullied its way here, representing casual workers who don't even work 10 to 15 days a year for her company in order to set a new national precedent. And I will table the remarks of Sarah Thomas of Egg Films, Mr. Speaker.
A minute and a half.
So, my question to the Premier, with hundreds of small business leaders like Sarah Thomas speaking up in defense of good jobs in Nova Scotia, while the Premier goes on with his own expensive playground agenda, what does he say to those small business employers trying to hire a few of their fellow Nova Scotians when they're faced with this kind of backlash?
Honourable the Premier.
In response to that question, what I say is, if you're going to play hockey, wear a helmet.
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the simple fact of the matter is that none of these, the CHLPA is a question of certification. It's not a question of contract. I mean, I think even those people who understand nothing about labor law could at least understand that.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, if the Premier wanted to give a complete and accurate answer to that last question, what he could have said was, if you want to come to Nova Scotia, invest in our province, and hire a few of our people, get a lawyer, because that's what companies like Egg Films are facing. That's what hockey clubs like the Cape Breton Screaming Eagles and the Halifax Mooseheads are facing. And what a shame. What a loss of investment and opportunity for our fellow Nova Scotians, because he is determined to force through first contract arbitration and let Nova Scotia be the breeding ground for these kinds of anti-job actions. Though I will ask the Premier at this time, when there are Nova Scotia families who are turning to food banks, working Nova Scotians that can't make enough, that they need to go to food banks, Mr. Speaker, will he explain to them why he's allowing working Nova Scotians abused as guinea pigs in his national union agenda?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I've never heard such a load of nonsense in my life. I got to tell you, this has nothing to do with certification. The legislation that's been introduced had nothing to do. It had nothing to do with any of the decisions that he's mentioned. Mr. Speaker, the next thing I know, the leader of the Conservative Party is going to be blaming the NHL lockout on me. What I can tell him about that is that there is a guy from Cole Harbour who's on the NHL bargaining committee. It's just not me.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
You hear? After that answer, I can hear NHL players rejoicing all across the nation. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Premier stood in this House and said, and I quote, "We have young people finally able to get jobs in our province," end of quote. However, one of the hardest hit segments of our province is our youth. Since the NDP has taken office, young Nova Scotians have been seen unemployment levels, Mr. Speaker, as high as increasing by almost 20% under his watch. So my question to the Premier is, why didn't the Premier know what the state of the youth employment was in Nova Scotia, or is it just his inexperience?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, if you want to see inexperience, what you should do is just look at some of the research that's being done on behalf of the Liberal Party. Simple fact of the matter is that there is an enthusiasm and there is a forward-looking air with young people today in this province. Last night I happened to be over at the Fusion Halifax event where we had young people talking about how great the future looks in Nova Scotia. Fact of the matter is that the students who come to Dalhousie, many of them, or other universities here, many of them are staying. They're choosing to make their life here. They are seeing for the first time on the horizon prosperity that we have not seen for 20 years, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Like John Buchanan's back in town. The offshore is coming someday, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if there's a single young Nova Scotian happy about the future, is they realize in the election in their future, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Premier seems to think young Nova Scotians are doing well in an economy that his government has created. None of the data supports his belief. The truth is, since the NDP have taken office, young people in Nova Scotia are facing 20% fewer job opportunities. Even more concerning, Mr. Speaker, is the trend of part-time work replacing full-time employment. Nova Scotians between the ages of 20 and 24 years of age saw a drop of full-time jobs of 31% and part-time work increasing by 43%, Mr. Speaker, under this NDP government. Mr. Speaker, those are exactly the young people who are saddled with tens of thousands of dollars of debt, desperately needing work experience, and are making a choice of whether to stay in Nova Scotia or not. So my question to the Premier, why is this government pursuing an economic race to the bottom that is forcing our sons and daughters to move out west? Or is it his experience?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I would start by reminding the Leader of the Liberal Party that it was actually a former Liberal Premier that talked about the future of the offshore, not John Buchanan, Mr. Speaker, held up the vial of oil and talked about the offshore. The reality is, the reality of the situation is, Mr. Speaker, that we are creating more jobs in this province, and in fact, we've created more seats in community college in order to be able to train more young people so that they will be able to stay in this province because they're gonna have good jobs. Mr. Speaker, do you know that for the first time there are actually signs up out west advertising for jobs back here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the slogan across communities across this province has been, let's go take a seat at community college. Maybe we'll get a part-time job under the NDP government, Mr. Speaker, because they're perfectly content, Mr. Speaker. This negative economic environment is not limited to rural Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Halifax is bleeding young people as well. The 2012 Halifax Vital Statistics report shows in the last decade, we have seen under 15 population drop by more than 5 times the national average. In that same period, the 30 to 40-year demographic also shrunk by 13%. Young people and young families said they're leaving because of poor job prospects. So my question to the Premier, when will the Premier realize that his bad economic policies are driving people out of this province, or is it just his inexperience?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, you want to see inner experience in action. It's that kind of question. He would know that after 20 years of the worst economic performance in the country under Liberal and Conservative governments, we are turning it around, Mr. Speaker. We got a big mess to clean up, but we're doing it.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Economic Development. For the past 4 years, including this year, the Minister's Department has sent to each Regional Development Authority $125,000, a total of over $1 million a year for each of those years. That money is supposed to be used for local, regional economic development. Now, Mr. Speaker, from time to time, the Nova Scotia Association of Regional Development Authorities has an annual meeting and a conference, and I want to ask the Minister where that conference was held last year in 2011 and whether he attended that conference.
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. I think now, I could be wrong because I've attended so many things, but I think that might have been in Fox Harbour. Now, don't take that to the bank because there have been a number of conferences that I attended, but I will check that out for sure. And I was there, and I've attended a number of conferences by the RDAs.
The Honourable Leader of the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I can assure the Minister I will not be taking Fox Harbour to the bank. However, I will refresh his memory because indeed the conference was held at Fox Harbour Golf Resort and Spa, a place that boasts both rich accommodations and warm hospitality, a place, according to its website, which is where you go to discover the joy found in life's finer pleasures. Mr. Speaker, the conference cost taxpayers of this province $700 for each attendee there, in addition to $15,000 to pay for CBC's Rex Murphy to be one of the keynote speakers, along with the Minister of Economic Development. At a time when Nova Scotians are being told to tighten their belts, when the NDP is cutting back in schools and hospitals, I asked the Minister, why did the Minister endorse such a flagrant abuse of taxpayers' money by agreeing to go and attend such an extravagant conference?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I just for the record, I will say, reiterate, I did attend, and I didn't charge anything for myself to be there. The decision to have this at Fox Harbour was made by the RDA Association. I simply got an invite, which I thought, as Minister of Economic and Rural Development, it was more than appropriate for me to be there, and I went.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the point is that money, the $1 million his department sends to RDAs, is to be used for regional economic development, not fancy conferences at Fox Harbour. This is a time when, in the last 3 years, 6,300 full-time jobs have been lost outside of Halifax. But instead of creating jobs in rural areas, the RDAs, under the supervision of this minister, attended a conference at Fox Harbour, costing $700 each. Fox Harbour, by the way, whose website says that they invite visitors, such as our RDA delegates, such as the Minister of Economic Development, to, and I quote, savor melt-in-your-mouth Atlantic lobster, flavorful Tatamagouche rack of lamb, superb wines from our exemplary cellar, and an array of enticing signature desserts. My question, Mr. Speaker, for the minister, will he explain to those many struggling Nova Scotians, those many unemployed Nova Scotians, whether going to Fox Harbour to such a fancy conference is part of his Jobs Here strategy?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what I will do is I'm not going to give you any fictional numbers. I'm going to give you facts, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is a fact that since June 2009 to this date, we created 8,800 jobs in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, it is a fact, Mr. Speaker, that we've invested millions. We've invested millions in the Irving Shipbuilding contract to create billions of dollars for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. That's a fact. Mr. Speaker, it is a fact that with this investment of millions of dollars in the Irving shipyard building the combat ships, we will create 11,500 jobs at the peak, Mr. Speaker. Those are the facts, Mr. Speaker. That's not fiction.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism, and I'm glad he's in the mood to share some facts because we certainly need some on DSME Trenton. This government spent $60 million for a 49% equity stake in DSME. In return, we were promised 500 jobs. As of August 3rd, 2012, the minister said approximately 66 people were employed at the plant. My question for the minister, how many people are currently employed at the SME?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are, without a doubt, less than 60 people employed at DSMT. Mr. Speaker, as I said yesterday, is that this is a new company for Nova Scotia, that there were some things that happened with respect to a new company that are simply unpredictable when it comes to the global economy. Mr. Speaker, we are dealing with a company from Korea that there had to be some cultural adjustments for this company as well. Mr. Speaker, what I can tell you, and again, if we want to deal with facts, that this company is in the business of planning and marketing itself globally, Mr. Speaker. I've got confidence in this government, this company, Mr. Speaker, and it will be successful.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, on August 3rd, 2012, the minister said, quote, if we foretell the future, and I would think if we knew where the energy market was going when it came to windmills, I'm not sure if DSMT would have been talking to us at all, end quote. During the same post-cabinet scrum, the minister admitted he did not know which markets the SME had access to. He admits the company is struggling, he admits he doesn't know their marketing plan, but he still insists he is cautiously optimistic, and I'll table those quotes. Mr. Speaker, my question, will the minister share the organization's business plan that allows him to remain cautiously optimistic after the fact that there are 60 people remaining working at the SME in Trenton today?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what I will table today for the member opposite, who despite my invitations, haven't taken me up on my offer, I will table the Jobs Here strategy, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I would encourage him to read that, Mr. Speaker. I will also table, Mr. Speaker, and if I may, Mr. Speaker, I just want to read something very, very recent from the Halifax Chamber of Commerce. In summary, and I quote, overall, as noted earlier, since 2009, the government of Nova Scotia has generally done a good job acting on the commitments laid out in the 2009 election campaign and should be and should be applauded for their efforts and dedication. It is important to keep in mind that this government came into office after economic challenging times. And there's more. I will table that, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister's department is responsible for investing taxpayers' dollars to generate employment and help develop economic opportunities in this province. So if the Minister wants to meet, what I want to know is, will he be available and willing to tell me how he failed Nova Scotians with $60 million of their money in Trenton? That's my question for the Minister.
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, this government has protected jobs in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. An example of that is the 1,400 jobs that we protected in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if we didn't do that, Mr. Speaker, there would be families in this province that would be left out. There would not be 14,000 people employed in that area today, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Mr. Speaker, those people would be looking for jobs in Western Canada, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the federal government received a request on the Access to Information legislation to make public the umbrella agreement that the federal government signed with the Irving Shipyard in Halifax. They agreed to release parts of those agreements. Irving Shipbuilding initially requested the court stop the release of this information, but withdrew the request. Now, both the federal government and Irving Shipbuilding are in agreement with that information should be made public. Mr. Speaker, does the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism agree that a key condition of spending public money or accepting public money is being open to public scrutiny?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the federal shipbuilding contract is probably the single most important event that certainly has happened in my lifetime. Mr. Speaker, at the peak of it, we are going to create 11,500 jobs, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are proud to say, and we will continue to say, the role that this government had in assisting Irving in securing that contract, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, anything that we do, we will not jeopardize the relationship that we have with Irving Shipbuilding. We are proceeding very, very carefully. We are not rushing into this. We are taking our time at it. And because, Mr. Speaker, we want to do it right, not like previous other governments.
Yeah. The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the contract was won by Irving Shipbuilding on merit. The competition is over. Details of the umbrella agreement are forthcoming. The federal government is willing to let the public know the facts. Irving Shipbuilding is willing to let the public know the facts. Why, Mr. Speaker, is the minister the only person unwilling to tell Nova Scotia the facts behind the $304 million that it gave to Irving Shipbuilding? Most of it, which will never be repaid to the taxpayers.
He don't know.
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, once again, the Irving Shipbuilding got that contract with the help of the province of Nova Scotia. If it hadn't have been, and Mr. Irving said this himself, if it hadn't been for the province of Nova Scotia, he said, we would never have won that contract, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are at the table with Irving, and we are creating jobs for Nova Scotians, 11,500 jobs at the peak.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the minister allowed $260 million of the loan he approved for Irving Shipbuilding to be forgivable. A giveaway, a handout, costing every Nova Scotian $325 per person. What, Mr. Speaker, is the minister hiding, and why is the minister and the NDP government the only ones keeping secrets now?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have invested millions of dollars in that Irving bid. We've invested millions, and we're going to get billions back. We will earn $2.8 billion, Mr. Speaker, giving us more money to invest in health care, to invest in education for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is an investment. Part of the money that we've invested in Irving will earn forgiveness based on milestones reached in terms of job, Mr. Speaker. This is a wise investment, a 6% investment, $2.8 billion, Mr. Speaker. They don't want that. They don't want that for Nova Scotians. Well, I can tell you, this government wants it.
The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The OECD calculates the rate of return on investing in education at roughly 9%. This is an impressive return for any investment. Given this NDP government's insistence on cutting education funding, it would seem that this government sees post-secondary education funding as a burden rather than an investment, Mr. Speaker, which is completely backwards. Will the Premier tell the members of this House whether he, the Minister of Finance, or the Minister of Labour and Education considered the rate of return on education investments before it slashed $100 million from our universities?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to just correct the member opposite. When we came into government, there was a fund of money that was a result of a trust that was set up between the federal and provincial governments, and it provided every year for the reduction of tuition in the province. And in fact, the year that we came in, that came to an end by the feds. And the federal government has not replenished that fund. So that meant that before we even looked at things like the inflationary costs that are associated with maintaining universities, salary increases, all of that, the first thing we had to do was backfill some $30 million associated with that. Had we not done that, the cost of tuition in this province would have gone up by 20%. But, Mr. Speaker, what we did do was we made sure that the students were shielded from those increases, and they had to make some modest contribution towards the inflationary costs associated with it. But that's what we did, Mr. Speaker. We helped protect students from the real costs associated with the end of federal funding.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
This is what this Premier does. He stands up and blames everybody else for the decisions that he's made. Right. This Premier cut $100 million out of our post-secondary education system. He says we didn't have money to put into it. Well, where'd they get the $600 million, Mr. Speaker, to give to 6 corporations in this province? They had $600 million for 6 corporations that laid off 1,300 people, but didn't have $100 million to invest in our education system, Mr. Speaker. And the province is going to hurt. Universities inject $805.2 million into Nova Scotia's economy every year. Universities are an economic driver for the province and are responsible annually for about $968 million in gross domestic product, $227 million in tax revenue, and $4.39 billion in economic output, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, this Premier doesn't care about any of that and chooses to cut education instead. My question to the Premier is, Mr. Speaker, students in universities are wondering why the Premier has endless amounts of cash for corporations. The Deputy Premier might find this funny, but I assure him students and their families don't. Why did he find all this money for 6 corporations, Mr. Speaker, but had to cut $100 million out of our universities? Here.
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the first thing that the member for Yarmouth ought to do is maybe get a math lesson. The simple fact of the matter is that not only did we backfill the $30 million, we're not blaming the federal government. We're just a fact. We're just acknowledging the fact that first thing we had to do was backfill all of that, and then we brought forward the graduate retention tax rebate, Mr. Speaker, in order to make sure that young people who were graduating had incentives to stay in the province. Then, Mr. Speaker, we brought in a debt cap that ensured that students in our province would not continue to have excessive debts. The reality of the situation in this province is that this government, the men and women who make up this caucus, have invested more money in students and student assistance than any government in the history of the province, with the exception of the advent of the student loan program.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
This is what we risk by cutting our education system, Mr. Speaker, a premier that doesn't know how to do math. We have cut $100 million out of our education system. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives lists Nova Scotia as the least affordable jurisdiction for post-secondary education, and yet we have a premier that stands up and brags about all the great things he's doing for our universities. Mr. Speaker, will the premier stand in this House today and tell the very students who supported him while in opposition that his government will stand up for students, reverse his funding cuts to universities, and deny any tuition increases coming out of the review?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I already pointed out, and there's a big difference between student assistance on the one hand and making sure that people have access to university and the question of tuition. People often equate them, but they are not the same. The simple fact of the matter is that we have made sure that assistance to students has continued to grow so that more young people will be able to take advantage of the great universities that we have here in our province. We want to ensure that if you have the capacity, the ability, not only to go to university, but to go to community college, we increase the number of seats in community college so that young people will have access to trades. And yes, we invested money in things like the largest industrial shipbuilding contract in our history, so that when these people graduate, when the engineering class graduates, they will have jobs. When the sheet metal workers class graduates, they will have jobs. When the plumbers graduate, they will have jobs. Mr. Speaker, we care about the young people of this province, and we want to make sure that they have the education they need and they get the jobs they deserve.
The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians and communities throughout our province are upset at the Premier's interference in the work of the Electoral Boundaries Commission. The Premier and the NDP government ordered the Commission to eliminate the protected ridings of Clare, Argyll, Preston and Richmond. One of the casualties of the Premier's interference has been the riding of Shelburne. The Premier feels that the residents of Shelburne were not heard by the Commission and therefore has decided that the Law Amendments Committee will meet in Shelburne. Could the Premier advise the House today and all Nova Scotians what other Nova Scotia communities negatively impacted by the Boundaries Report will be visited by the Law Amendments Committee?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it's a Boundary Commission report. In fact, they went to those communities, and many of them, they met with the residents who were there. They met with the terms of reference that was decided by the House of Assembly, Mr. Speaker, and they produced a report, as I pointed out, that did not address the position in Shelburne. So we think it's only fair that they have a voice. The fact of the matter is that other places have had an opportunity to give input.
The honourable member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, on Sunday, October 28, I attended a meeting in Harbour-Boucher where residents gathered to express their dissatisfaction with the final report of the Boundaries Commission that would put Antigonish County residents east of the Tracadie River in the new riding of East Nova. Councillors and residents felt that they did not have the opportunity to express their dissatisfaction as the revised interim report recommended keeping Antigonish County as a stand-alone riding. In today's issue of the Port Hawkesbury Reporter, the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal is quoted with the heading, "He urged those in attendance to keep up the pressure to save the current Antigonish riding." Quote, "Write the Premier. Get on the telephone and call people," end quote, said the minister, who also urged residents to sign a petition made available by municipal councillors at the meeting. Quote, "Let's try and stop this in some way." period. And the only way you're going to do this is to make your voices heard. So my question is that since the Premier is sending the Law Amendments Committee to the riding of the Minister of Environment and Fisheries in Shelburne, will he also send the Law Amendments Committee to Harvard-Boucher in the riding of his Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, first thing I'd like to do is congratulate the Minister on the representation of his riding. Obviously, he was doing his job, encouraging them to get out and to make representations. The Law Amendments Committee, of course, is here. It is open to anyone who wants to come and to state their opinion with respect to these proceedings. Of course, that the decision to travel will ultimately be the decision of the committee. But I have to say, I think that in fact some of the people, as I understand it, who actually attended that meeting were at some of the meetings by the Electoral Boundaries Commission. But again, we certainly invite them to attend at the committee meetings.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I as well will commend the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal, because like myself, he actually went in front of the Electoral Boundaries Commission to represent his constituents, unlike the Minister from Shelburne, who at the time, Mr. Speaker, did not make any representations, and based on today, it would appear that he's in timeout today as well and unable to speak on behalf of the people for Shelburne as well. Mr. Speaker, the residents of Harvard-Boucher are saying that they felt they did not have the opportunity to be able to express concerns over the proposed change based what was on the revised report. The Premier is now telling us it's up to the committee. He knows full well that it's his government that decided Law Amendments Committee would go down to Shelburne. The committee did not meet, it was not asked, and nor was there an opportunity for us to make representation on behalf of people such as those from Harvard-Boucher. So I would ask the Premier, in light of all of this, in light of the statements made previously by his Minister of Fisheries and Environment before his timeout, will the Premier advise Nova Scotians today that on this very issue, will he allow his backbenchers and his ministers to have a free vote when this bill comes for final consideration?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, there is an independent report that is before the House. We're going to have an opportunity to, and are having an opportunity to debate it fully. As you know, I look forward to all of that debate. I believe the member for Shelburne had an opportunity to already speak with respect to the legislation. And the simple fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, this is, it's not about the democracy that we operate in. And, Mr. Speaker, that's why it is necessary for the Electoral Boundaries Committee to adhere to the terms of reference, and that's why it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we consider that whole report very seriously. And we also consider when the Boundaries Committee did not have an opportunity to hear from people like in Shelburne, that they have an opportunity to have their voice heard.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Last Thursday, just prior to all of the flurry that surrounds opening day at the legislature, the minister sent out a press release that his government plans to hire 7 auditors who will in turn support other auditors in the districts. According to the release, the hiring of 7 auditors will ensure we receive better frontline health care. Can the minister please tell the House how the hiring of 7 auditors will provide better frontline health care?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's extremely important that Nova Scotians recognize that we need to ensure that the money that they provide government is spent in the most appropriate way. We spend $3.8 billion on the health care budget, Mr. Speaker. I think Nova Scotians would appreciate that an audit is done with the district health authorities across this province.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we had 2 regional hospitals in the last few weeks who could no longer take patients due to overcrowding. We see patients continuing to flood to emergency departments because they don't have access to a family doctor. Collaborative emergency centres that were to be the solution to keep ERs open 24/7 are experiencing closures, not to mention those ERs that are still experiencing closures on a regular basis. And yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, frontline health workers have lost their jobs under this government, despite what the minister might say. Please tell Nova Scotians how this government can justify the hiring of 7 internal auditors when clearly frontline health care is in chaos.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The important thing here is to recognize that the taxpayers of Nova Scotia fund the healthcare system here in Nova Scotia, and in ensuring that the $3.8 billion is spent appropriately and that most, if not all of that money goes to ensuring services for Nova Scotians across Nova Scotia is the key and is extremely important, Mr. Speaker. We're showing leadership by ensuring that audits are done and that the money that we spend here in Nova Scotia on healthcare is spent in the most appropriate way. We recognize that services across the province have to be adequate. That's why we have plans, Mr. Speaker. Unlike former governments that just did things the way they did for years and years, Mr. Speaker. Liberal governments, Conservative governments, we have a plan, Mr. Speaker, that's better care sooner, and it's going to address the healthcare needs of Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure those that are in long wait lists today are happy about $3 million going down to Cornwallis. I think you'll see something very different. Last week, a spokesperson for the Department of Health and Wellness told media that the cost of the hiring of an additional 7 auditors is close to $750,000, that the money was found in the health budgets to fund the expenditure. Mr. Speaker, this is $750,000 that will be coming out of the healthcare system each and every year, which will be added to an additional internal audit function that already exists in 9 districts. Can the minister please tell us how he does not see this as a duplication of financial administration?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
One of the things, Mr. Speaker, that we take very seriously in the Department of Health is the audits that the Auditor General does. And one of the things we recognize is in implementing and responding to the recommendations of the Auditor General. And this is responding to a direct recommendation from the Auditor General. It's important that Nova Scotians recognize that the government is continuing to invest in not only frontline health care, Mr. Speaker, but in home care, in long-term care. That's why I'm glad to spend an additional $22 million this year on home care support, Mr. Speaker, so that seniors living in their homes across Nova Scotia, especially in rural communities, get the service they need, Mr. Speaker. As I said in my previous answer, this government has a plan. We're not going to do things the way the former governments, Liberals and Conservatives, did for years and years, Mr. Speaker. They had no plan. They just spent money everywhere they thought they needed it, Mr. Speaker. We have a plan. It's called Better Care Sooner, and Nova Scotians will recognize the work we're doing when it comes to health care service in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on a new question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think this next question will tell us exactly how well the former Minister of Health did and what is continuing. Mr. Speaker, while many patients struggle to access health care services, there appears to be a company that is about to embark upon filling the gaps. Medibus is planning to start with 4 vehicles on the road in November and will have 8 units on the road within 8 months. The first 4 months, these units will operate in HRM, Lunenburg County, and in Yarmouth, Digby, Annapolis areas. This service is intended to provide both insured and non-insured healthcare services in a mobile setting throughout Nova Scotia. My question to the minister, is the minister aware that Medibus will soon be providing mobile health services in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
No, I'm not, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Well, I guess perhaps I should start off then, Mr. Speaker, with tabling the Medibus plan for the province. Mr. Speaker, no one is questioning the delivery of mobile healthcare services. In fact, it has worked in this province in the form of the mobile breast screening started under a Liberal government, unfortunately has become significantly reduced under an NDP government. The fundamental question is who will be paying for the insured services? Will patients who access publicly funded healthcare services through Medibus pay for services that are already provided elsewhere in the public health system, free of charge, thus creating a two-tier system. Could the minister please outline all of the funding his government has provided or intends to provide to Medibus for the delivery of mobile healthcare services, including whether government plans to cover the cost of those insured services the company intends to deliver?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the one thing I can say to the minister or the member opposite is that the NDP and an NDP government recognize the importance of a single-tier, a publicly funded Medicare system, Mr. Speaker, and we're not going to waver from that, Mr. Speaker. We continue to invest in the publicly funded system here in Nova Scotia, and we recognize that Nova Scotians want us to ensure that they have ensure that they have services provided to them, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to do that, and I can guarantee the member opposite that the single-tiered, publicly funded Medicare system will be well protected in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, accessing healthcare services has been a frustrating proposition for Nova Scotians. There is indeed a gap that is growing, and would appear that in the absence of any government action, a company has recognized this fact and is about to address these gaps by providing medical services that are both insured and non-insured. My question to the minister: who will be responsible for monitoring the quality and standards of healthcare services provided by Medibus?
Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that really is at the essence of the publicly funded healthcare system. We need to ensure that Nova Scotians receive the proper care in the communities that they receive that in, Mr. Speaker. I can't predict when, but I know, and it's not no secret, that we've asked for consultation, went out and got consultation around the Health Insurance Act, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to the member opposite when I do introduce that piece of legislation to fully support it, because it will protect a publicly funded one-tier Medicare system here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question to you is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, as the Minister is aware, the request for proposals for a recovery house in Cape Breton closed recently, and Talbot House in French Vale was the sole applicant. Now, the board of Talbot House was reluctant at first to submit an application based on the government's requirement that any new recovery house use methadone. The minister must be aware that this is going against the philosophy of Talbot House, which was the last remaining recovery house in the province to not use methadone treatment. So my question through you to the minister: is the minister going to insist that methadone treatment be part of whether or not Talbot House is successful, or will he give Talbot House the freedom to use their own method of treatment?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No question recovery houses play an important role in helping men and women across our province deal with addictions. They play an important role, and they're one of many services in a suite of services here in Nova Scotia that support and hopefully treat addictions and addiction services here in Nova Scotia. I've said it recently with the recovery houses coming under the Department of Health and Wellness that it's business as usual. I have had the opportunity already to tour one of the recovery houses over in Dartmouth, Freedom Foundation. I was well received there, Mr. Speaker. They do some amazing work, and I've met with some of the clients, some of the residents that live there, and they recognize the important work that they do, and I recognize the important work that recovery houses do here in Nova Scotia and what they provide the men and women here in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the bottom line is Talbot House worked. Without it, too many families have suffered unfairly. Addiction is a serious problem in this province, and we can't afford to go without Talbot House any longer. It would be a shame if the minister held the requirement to provide methadone above the need for a recovery house. So my question through you to the minister: would the minister rather see Nova Scotia go without this vital resource than allow Talbot House to go forward with their tested and true treatment philosophy?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a former healthcare worker, I recognize that there are different ways to treat people here in Nova Scotia. I recognize that, and I keep that at heart, Mr. Speaker. We recognize the importance of recovery houses. That's why we had the RFP extended, which just closed last week. The Department of Health staff are going to do their due diligence in reviewing the RFP and the submissions, Mr. Speaker, under the RFP, and we look forward to making a decision quite soon.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Cape Breton has been without a recovery house for nearly 8 months. Through the reckless actions of the Minister of Community Services, they closed their doors, and many Nova Scotian families were unable to get accessible treatment for their loved ones. Talbot House's 17-bed facility was successful in changing the lives of men with addictions for more than 50 years. It was effective, trusted, and respected. The Minister said a review would be complete by the end of the year. So my question through you to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, is, with only one RFP submitted, and the fact that Cape Breton has been without a recovery house for months, will the Minister guarantee to open a recovery house in Cape Breton as soon as possible?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I recognize the importance of recovery houses throughout the province and the one that was in Cape Breton. We recognize the importance of that. We know that there are addiction services being provided in Cape Breton currently, and as I said to the minister or the member earlier, we're reviewing the RFP process. We're going to make a decision, and we want to make the right decision to ensure that we can continue to meet the needs of Nova Scotians, especially the needs of men and women in Cape Breton who find themselves struggling with an addiction, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to that process, and I look forward to an announcement soon, hopefully by the end of the year, on this decision here so that we can provide services in Cape Breton as well as the rest of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on November 5th, 2009, Bill 52 was given royal assent in this legislature. At that time, government indicated the bill would provide public accountability to communities and ministerial accountability for emergency departments. Given that legislation points to the fact that a report needs to be tabled annually, I'm not sure whether to ask the former minister or the current, but we'll go with the current. What has prevented a minister from tabling the emergency room accountability report as is mandated by law?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness. Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. And I want to first commend the former Minister of Health here in Nova Scotia. She's worked extremely hard with the staff within the department to ensure that we change how health care is delivered in Nova Scotia, how we change the government to be more accountable and transparent when it comes to health care here in Nova Scotia. So I want to commend the minister, the former minister of that, and we're going to continue to work with our department and all district health authorities and health clinicians across the province to be transparent and accountable, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
I don't think this is going to be a good report, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the last emergency room accountability report was tabled on May 19, 2011, 531 days ago today. We now have waited 531 days for this government to once again be accountable to the public as to their success in ensuring all ERs are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Mr. Speaker, as if it isn't bad enough, Nova Scotians have to wait to access healthcare services. Now they also have to wait for this government to be accountable. Could the minister outline the specific reasons as to why there's been such a delay in the release of the emergency room accountability report?
Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I said earlier in a response from a previous question, the one thing that we recognized here in Nova Scotia when we came to government in 2009 is that we had to do things differently, especially in healthcare, Mr. Speaker. And we're doing things differently. We're not doing it the liberal way, cutting and slashing, firing doctors and nurses, Mr. Speaker. We're not doing it the conservative way, when you just stick your head in the sand and ignore all the issues, Mr. Speaker. We've come up with a plan. It's called Better Care Sooner. We've come up with a plan to address emergency room closures like collaborative emergency centers, something, Mr. Speaker, that my colleagues from across the country are looking at and adopting, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud of that accomplishment.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think if we gave scrutiny to the system, we'd find many, many gaps and holes. Like 5,000 patients without a doctor in Shelburne, 1 doctor left in Digby, and on we can go. Mr. Speaker, we are simply asking for this government to be accountable like they said they would. It's no big secret to the numerous communities across this province that they have experienced emergency room closures last year. Many of these same communities are still experiencing emergency room closures today, despite what government promised. Could the minister please tell us when the emergency room accountability report will be tabled?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And no question, there continue to be issues within the healthcare system. We recognize that. But the one thing we are sure of, Mr. Speaker, is that we're responding to those issues. That's why I was glad to announce today welcoming new doctors to Nova Scotia under the CAP program, Mr. Speaker. All of them practicing in rural communities, Mr. Speaker. That's why I was glad to go meet 5 new residency doctors down in the valley, down where the members' riding is, Mr. Speaker. 5 of them who are doing a new program under the residency program here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. All 5 of them took their training outside Nova Scotia. 4 of them are from Nova Scotia, but I got to say, the most exciting one that I talked to was the lady from Ontario, who was from Ottawa, and loves the valley, and has said to me about a month after the program, she's staying here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. So we recognize there are still issues within the healthcare system. We're coming forward with a plan. We're implementing that plan, Mr. Speaker. You don't have to go far. You can ask the member from Tatamagouche on how well that the CEC is being accepted in Tatamagouche. You can ask the leader of the third party about how the residents of Parsboro like the CEC in Parsboro, Mr. Speaker. That's all I need to reflect, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work. And Annapolis, Mr. Speaker, the leader of the Liberal Party can ask the member or the residents from Annapolis how they like the new model, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work on it.
The honourable member for Halifax, Clayton Park.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the previous Minister of Finance promised a balanced budget in the spring on numerous occasions, and he's now left the new Minister of Finance holding the bag. Yet from day one in her new job, the current Minister of Finance has been backing away from that commitment and tentative in her discussions of it. We're heading yet now to another broken promise. My question for the Minister of Finance is, will the Minister deliver a balanced budget in the spring of 2013?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I want to take this opportunity to thank the former Minister of Finance for putting us on the right track to a balanced budget. And Mr. Speaker, I have indicated that we have challenges in front of us without a doubt because of the magnitude of the mess that we inherited from the Rodney MacDonald government. I think that's very well understood, Mr. Speaker. However, I'm very pleased to say that we're working hard, we're on track, we're keeping our eye on where it is we want to be. We have a plan. It is working, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to tabling a budget in the spring.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are bracing for deeper and deeper cuts to education, health and social programs. The NDP has already cut $65 million from education, $100 million from universities, and more than $50 million from health care. And this minister still has to find a further $250 million to even approach balance. Mr. Speaker, the consensus from private sector economists is that the Nova Scotia economy is headed for a downgrade in 2012, that our growth will be just 1.5% growth rather than the higher amount, 12% less than the Department of Finance had in their estimates for this year's growth. So, Mr. Speaker, and I can table actually the current economic environment document from the Department of Finance. Thanks. Mr. Speaker, will the minister explain exactly how, with an almost 12% downgrade in the GDP growth estimates, how that will affect her balanced budget promise and how much this NDP government will have to cut now from education, health and social programs?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member knows full well that this government did not cut $100 million from universities, for example. We did not cut the amounts of money that they say we cut, $65 million from education. It's a ridiculous allegation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if you look at the budget numbers, in fact, this government has increased funding in the healthcare system every year that we've been in government, Mr. Speaker. We have, without a doubt, a challenge in front of us. We inherited a mess. We're operating in a period of time when the recovery from the recession has been slower than anticipated. We've taken a very balanced approach to this province's finances, Mr. Speaker. We've imposed temporary tax increases. We've brought spending down. We've been able to bring every department's spending in under budget 3 years in a row, Mr. Speaker. We're investing in the economy. We're growing jobs. Mr. Speaker, this is a premier I want on my side when my community is experiencing difficulties, not that guy over there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance is boasting about cutting spending in every department, and yet she denies that they've cut $65 million from education, $100 million from universities, and on and on. It's one or the other, Mr. Speaker. It can't be both. Those are the facts. Mr. Speaker, education has been gutted. You can ask the NSTU, you can ask the universities themselves, you can talk to the experts in every field, and not only have we cut costs and expenditures in all of these departments, the NDP have actually abandoned principles that they once held dear, and that must hurt. It must. That's worse. Mr. Speaker, after all these cuts, in the face of all of these cuts and enormous corporate welfare, those enormous corporate welfare deals as well, it seems the minister can't keep the balanced budget promise. And since she did not answer it the first time, Mr. Speaker, I would like to return to that question and ask the minister that in the face of 8,600 fewer full-time jobs this year and a downgrade from the private sector forecasters of 12% downgrade in our growth, will the minister tell Nova Scotia if she will keep the government's promise to balance next year's budget?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to tell the honourable member what this government will do in difficult times to handle this province's finances is not what that government did in difficult times. We will not impose tolls on the highways of this province. We will not build P3 schools. We will not suspend collective bargaining, Mr. Speaker. We will not send nurses home, Mr. Speaker, and pay them to leave the labor force. Mr. Speaker, we will use a balanced approach. We are on track, Mr. Speaker, and that's the NDP philosophy, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, the folks in Yarmouth and the tourism industry was encouraged to hear that this government has reversed its long-standing stubborn position on the Yarmouth Ferry. We consider that a win for our community home, for the tourism industry in the province, and for this opposition caucus who has been fighting for that recognition for the last 3 years. Mr. Speaker, the minister responsible is quoted as saying they're doing this to revitalize southwestern Nova Scotia to bring this ferry back. And my question to the minister is, Mr. Speaker, what took him so long to see the light?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that most members, if not all members in this House, will recall when the decision was made about the ferry. We admitted that it was a tough decision. I can recall many times taking my place in this House and saying to all members of the House that we would love to see a ferry in Yarmouth. And Mr. Speaker, that hasn't changed. I am saying the same things now that I said a year ago, 2 years ago, and 3 years ago, that we are willing to invest $21 million over a 7-year period. However, Mr. Speaker, the right conditions have to be in place. And part of the right conditions, Mr. Speaker, include other partners, other stakeholders to be involved, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, those right conditions will be the federal government involvement, Mr. Speaker. Those right conditions will include...
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. I'll now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition to call business.
Speaker, could you call Bill 103, please?
Bill 103. The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to rise today and to speak on the Bill 103, which is a bill that was introduced by our leader, Stephen McNeil, the Leader of the Official Opposition. And this bill is entitled, "An Act to Ensure Accountability in Providing Economic Development Assistance in Nova Scotia." Mr. Speaker, this bill speaks directly to the level of largesse that the NDP government is demonstrating over the last 3 years with corporate handouts, corporate welfare, corporate giveaways, without the control and without the transparency that would ensure that Nova Scotians know what the deals are, and without knowing that the deals are good for Nova Scotians. And so what does the bill ask, Mr. Speaker? I'd like to begin with that before we go through the litany, the long list of government deals that have been cut in the last 3 years with big business. It's interesting, you know, Madam Speaker, before I even begin, to point out that today the Minister of Industry or Business brought in a large number of smaller business people to talk about their successes. But the hallmark of this government has been giveaways to big business. That's the hallmark, that's the legacy you'll take with you. And I know it's a shock to anybody who supported the NDP that that's the way it's going, and people are aghast to see that that will be your legacy, your hallmark, your mark in the future. Madam Speaker, it's been a real shock, frankly, in the last 3 years, that this bill speaks directly to the problems we've seen with those kind of corporate deals, the kind of deals that have no guarantees in them, that are forgivable loans, that don't tie the money we give out to job maintenance, retention, let alone growth. We've seen money go out to companies one after the other where they're decreasing their workforce rather than increasing. And we've seen enormously incorrect estimates of jobs that will be created. And, you know, probably the best one is what we heard again today in question period, the figure of 10,000 jobs coming from the Irving shipyard project. Irving themselves have less than 2,000 direct jobs, they've said. They're not boasting about 5 times that, even with the indirect jobs. So, you know, it's enormously off base in terms of what we're hearing. So Bill 103, Madam Speaker, is designed to specifically provide transparency, openness, and accountability in the field of negotiating, government negotiating with large corporations and making these kind of very huge commitments that we've been seeing. So what's in the bill? I'd like to just make sure that everybody understands what the bill entails. First of all, the bill entails a requirement that the details of all of these deals would be made perfectly open and transparent and made public. So they say that if you receive public money, then there must be a copy of each of the agreements that are in place, and that has to be made public. It has to include, because we know that sometimes those deals will be enormous and very difficult to wade through, might be very legal in the way they're written. So we're asking in this bill as well that accountability includes a written summary of the economic development assistance that will be provided pursuant to the agreement, and that it will also have a written summary and explanation of the terms and conditions of each agreement. There's also supposed to be a document that will identify the business activities to which each agreement relates. So we want clarity about what it is that's expected from the business that's going to get these millions and millions of dollars that come from the pockets of Nova Scotians, that come out of our hard-earned money that we pay. And Madam Speaker, in Nova Scotia, we pay the highest taxes in the country. But most Nova Scotians could understand that if they're getting value for the money they pay. And that's what I hear from the constituents I represent. If they know that we're getting government services, a high quality of health care, good education, you know, reasonable roads to drive on, people are pretty understanding, but they don't like to hear of millions of dollars going out the door in something as nebulous as forgivable loans, something that you can't even put your head around how you can just forgive these loans. We want to know what the benefits are that are going to come back to Nova Scotia. We want to know the expectations the government has, and we want you to make it public. And if this bill were to pass, that's exactly what would happen. We actually put a time frame on it. We say that within 30 days of entering into an agreement, the recipient shall submit to the minister the documents that are referred to, that I already referred to, Madam Speaker. And within 30 days of any amendment to the agreement, they have to be made, those amendments have to be made public. And that will prevent any of the shady dealings that can go on where agreements are changed and things become somewhat different than they were intended. And we want to make sure that can't happen. So if there are official amendments, we want to make sure that they're made public. Again, the overriding issue here is transparency and openness and accountability. And I can't stress that enough, Madam Speaker, that we need to hear that. We need to see it in writing. We need to have it made public so that any member of the public can look at these arrangements. We've said further that the recipient shall on a quarterly basis, so 4 times a year, give a progress report. What are you doing with that money? If we had such a system in place right now, Madam Speaker, we'd know what was going on in Trenton with the Daewoo plant. We'd know where the contracts were, whether or not they'd met their requirements. We're 3 years into that deal. We're past that. It was the first big deal cut by the NDP government. And it was to save jobs, and I understand that is exactly what we want to do, but the jobs haven't been saved. The plant is apparently operating, but we are $60 million into it as taxpayers, and we can tell you the Liberal caucus was in New Glasgow in, I guess it was in June, and there were 6 cars in the parking lot, 6 on a work day. That plant is not operating at anywhere near. It's not doing anything. I think that could be maintenance. That's just a skeleton staff to put the lights on and open the door. It's not operating, Madam Speaker. And the people of Nova Scotia paid $60 million through a government arrangement to be shareholders, to actually have an ownership stake in this company that's doing nothing. And if we had an accountability act like this Act 103 before us, we'd be able to track that, we'd be able to know where we're at, we'd be able to have straightforward answers so that we wouldn't have to be asking the minister, and he wouldn't be fishing for the answers about how many people are working there, because it would be in the quarterly reports. And we'd all of us have an up-to-date accountability of where we're at. And I mean, really, it's shameful to go, Madam Speaker, to see that that's an organization, a company that we're invested in, and that nothing is happening there. So, you know, I understand that economies change, and I understand that markets change, but surely there was a business plan before we invested $60 million. You know, the Premier today was actually making fun of consultants, and I think consultants sometimes can help, because they might have told you, they might have told the government, pardon me, they might have explained to the government or the people making that deal whether or not there was an adequate business plan. Because I don't believe that it was properly analyzed, because nothing has materialized around the Daewoo plant in Trenton. So that is just one example of the kind of problems that we've had. We need targets, we need timelines, we need to know that those companies that are going to get our support, you know, and there are many times that might be a good move. If they're getting support, let them be accountable, and let them agree to quarterly reports and progress reports back to the government and back to the House of Assembly. That's what we want to see. We want those documents published so that they're available, and so the last point in the bill says that the minister shall publish the documents submitted, and it will be on a public website maintained and operated by the province. So, Madam Speaker, that would mean that anybody in the communities where those projects are taking place, or here in Halifax, wherever it may be, you would be able to track the kind of agreements that the government has entered into, and whether there is any value for money for the taxpayers of Nova Scotia. And Madam Speaker, it really is our biggest concern that we get that value for the taxpayers, because it is a difficult time. 8,600 fewer Nova Scotians are working in full-time jobs. I know that the stats show an increase in part-time work, but that may not even be individual jobs, because it's probably individual jobs, but it might be one person doing 2 or 3 part-time jobs, because I'm sure every member of this legislature knows of Nova Scotians who are doing exactly that to keep body and soul together. It's not easy. With part-time work, you find that you're taking whatever extra hours you can get, and people are working all in many different locations to try and make a living. And it's terribly difficult. There's no benefits. There's no security in those jobs. Often they're casual as well, and it's a very difficult life for anybody that is relegated to that role. And if we're losing full-time jobs that have benefits and we're replacing them with part-time jobs, it's just not adequate for making a living for people who need to make a living. And Madam Speaker, the bill before us is really talking, as I said, about accountability, and it's specific to the economic development assistance that's given out by the province of Nova Scotia. And Madam Speaker, I've been a member here since 2003, and I did not see the kind of, I guess, numerous agreements that have been entered into, as we've seen in the last 3 years, we did not see under the previous government, is what I'm trying to say. It's very funny. We had a Conservative government one might have thought would be doing more of that. It wasn't as apparent, and suddenly we have a government that's almost, well, it's over $500 million that they have put forth, $590 million given to just 6 corporations. Some of that, of course, promised, some of that not out the door yet, but some of it out the door to companies that have closed their door and left the province. You know, probably the most notable there, Bowater. Now, Bowater got a chunk of change, 25 or more million dollars, and they bought land. I understand that. The people of Nova Scotia now own more land on the South Shore. But that $25 million for land as well did not go into helping the company or helping the plant to continue to operate. It went straight out to the parent company in Quebec. We know that it went to support and to shore up the plants that were competing with the Bowater plant. And so it was just one step quicker, really, in the closure of our plant in Liverpool. And so, you know, that was one mistake right there. I mean, to see that much money committed and to see the plant close in less than 6 months. Even the people in Queens that we spoke to in February last year thought it might be good for a couple of years. They weren't optimistic that this plant had a long time to operate, that they felt the industry was changing, that probably the demand for newsprint was going to dictate that their plant wouldn't be operating for a long time. But nobody expected it would be such a short period of time. So this assistance or bailout was really, you know, completely misguided. And again, it adds millions of dollars towards this total figure of $590 million that we're talking about over the last number of years. Madam Speaker, there are a number of other projects, so I'd like to mention them as well. Certainly Port Hawkesbury is another one, and what's interesting is not only the amount of government support, but the fact that in order to continue on, the company has wrestled huge concessions from Labour, from the municipality, from Nova Scotia Power. Everybody's been pushed to the wall on this. And, you know, you have to look at whether or not it's going to be for the best all the way around. I think it's been a tremendously difficult project and support from the government of Nova Scotia. Wouldn't it be nice if this bill were in place and had passed and was proclaimed, and we actually could see the details of that agreement? What has the government of Nova Scotia committed to? And we would see not just the 200 or 300 pages, Madam Speaker, we'd actually get to see the detail. We'd get to have a summary. We'd know what the commitments were, and we'd be able to track them against a timeline. That's what we want. We want to be able to say to Nova Scotians, you can see what deals have been entered into by the province of Nova Scotia with your hard-earned tax dollars. Because make no doubt, no mistake, Madam Speaker, it is $590 million to date in the NDP mandate given to 6 corporations, several of whom have closed their doors, one that's about to close their doors, and no job guarantees, and in fact fewer people working in those companies than there were before. So, Madam Speaker, I know that we will hear some more good speakers on this subject, and I look forward to their input. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize the honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's been interesting to listen to the member for Clayton Park speak to Bill 103, but I think it's somewhat ironic that the Leader of the Opposition would bring forward a bill about accountability and economic development. Perhaps, Madam Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition should be looking to his right and chat with the member from Cape Breton South about when he was Minister of Economic Development. Perhaps, Madam Speaker, that may not help to educate the Liberal leader, because when he was when the MLA for Cape Breton South was the Minister of Economic Development, he actually spent more time under RCMP investigation for influence peddling than he did helping the economy in this province, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I would like to table an article, which I am ready to do now, from the Charlottetown Guardian from
Order,
June.
please. Order. The honourable member is not allowed to use the terminology influence peddling. I would ask you to retract those that terminology.
I'll retract that phrase. Madam Speaker, I'd like to table an article, nonetheless, from the Charlottetown Guardian from June 1999 to remind the Leader of the Opposition, and to remind, in fact, all Nova Scotians, that the Liberal Party's track record on economic development is questionable at best. And Madam Speaker, I would also like to table an article from the Daily News, an independent newspaper that some of us here will remember, in which an independent business lobbyist called for the Department of Economic Development to be shut down because it had overspent its budget by $18.5 million, also under the watchful eye of none other than the MLA for Cape Breton South. But, Madam Speaker, the department, in fact, didn't get shut down. It only remained mired in controversy during the MLA for Cape Breton South tenure as minister. However, Madam Speaker, to continue this little historical tutorial, the Leader of the third party, to change the direction a little bit, took care of the shutdown of economic development when he was the Chief of Staff for the Tories. Madam Speaker, under the watchful eye of the Leader of the Conservatives, the Department of Economic Development was reduced to an office, Madam Speaker, complete with job cuts and a slash in the budget of more than 15%. And Madam Speaker, I will table an article from the Canadian press that in fact states these facts. So, Madam Speaker, when we came into office, I think I'd like to remind you in 2009, we were subjected, as has been pointed out in this House earlier today, to the worst economic record in Canada for 20 years. That's what we inherited. That's part of the mess that we inherited. Madam Speaker, the neglect and mismanagement, just to use another example, had allowed the deficit for road development to have risen to $4 billion. And Madam Speaker, together, those two parties on the other side had run up a debt of more than $12 billion. So, Madam Speaker, it's obvious to me, and it should be obvious to every member of this House, that when it comes to economic development, the opposition are best left right where they are, in opposition. So, Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker, as I'm reflecting on my response to Bill 103, what I want to say.
Order, please.
Yeah, who wrote that?
I'd like to remind all the members that it gets a little loud. I do have to listen to the speaker to make sure that he is speaking on the intent of the bill.
But he hasn't spoken to it yet.
Yeah, and I would remind the member to also to make sure that you are speaking on the bill. The honourable member for Kings North has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And in fact, I am speaking. I have been speaking and will continue to speak to Bill 103 because, in fact, our government has been upfront and forthcoming with the details of the investments we've made in every area. We, in fact, have nothing to hide. Last year, when we created the Jobs Fund, we did that in large part to do what we said we would do, and that's to increase the transparency that's involved in the investments that are made in Nova Scotia, and to keep Nova Scotians informed of what those investments mean. And in addressing Bill 103 in the direction they have, what I would like to say is that they're willfully misleading Nova Scotians and causing unnecessary confusion. Quite frankly, that's not very responsible. The fact is, Nova Scotians, not just here in this House, but Nova Scotians all over this province, expect this government.
Order, please. Order. The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As I was saying, the fact is.
Order. The honourable member for Kings North has the floor.
The fact, Madam Speaker, is that Nova Scotians expect their government to make sound investments in creating good jobs, and they expect this government to help grow the economy while being accountable for the tax dollars that are invested. And as with all investments, sometimes certain information must remain confidential to protect the competitive interests of Nova Scotian businesses. I think Nova Scotians understand that. I don't know if the members of the opposition understand that, but it's part of doing business. And if this information was not kept confidential, businesses may lose their competitive advantage in the province and around the world. Or worse, and certainly this would be worse, Madam Speaker, they might go out of business, costing Nova Scotian workers.
Order, please. This is the last time I'm going to ask. I would advise the members, if they have something to say, it's a conversation they're having with another member, take it outside the chamber. I need to be able to hear the member. The honourable member for Kings North has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The point that I was trying to make is that if some information is not kept confidential at the right times, it may create very serious difficulties for business. It may help businesses lose their competitive advantage, and it may actually force business failures. And business failures would cost Nova Scotian workers the good jobs that they deserve. There's been some talk in the introduction to Bill 103 that the province has given millions of dollars to 6 large companies. Those and has laid off 1,300 workers. Those numbers, in fact, are fiction. The honourable member who used those numbers in the House is misleading Nova Scotians. Here are some real numbers, if I could speak to that more directly, Madam Speaker. Shipbuilding contracts promise 11,000 jobs during peak production and promise $2.8 billion in additional revenue over the next 19 years. This is an investment in our future. The province invested, as has also been pointed out in this House on many occasions, so you would think the members of the opposition would have heard it, but the province has invested millions to leverage billions of dollars far into the future. The opposition, in pointing out things in the way that they have, is playing with the facts to suit its own purpose. And despite what the opposition claims, employment is up in this province by 8,800 jobs, and unemployment is down and remains at its lowest in the region. These, Madam Speaker, are the facts. Provincial investments have generated more than $80 million in the past 7 years, and that's tens of millions of dollars that's been reinvested in services Nova Scotians rely on, like health and education and community services. This government has helped protect, as everyone in this House knows, 1,400 jobs in the Strait region. 1,400 jobs that are related to the men, the women, the families, and the small business who didn't lose their jobs, who didn't close their doors, and who didn't move out west because of the decisions that this government took.
That's right.
I would like, Madam Speaker, to speak a little further to Bill 103 about the investment in the Irving shipbuilding contract. The province has released the terms and conditions with as much information as we could under the rules and regulations related to FOIPOP. The province has invested in Irving shipbuilding in order to win the shipbuilding and the federal contracts. A technical briefing was conducted at the time for media when the loan was announced, and it provided as much detail as possible at that moment. Another briefing was held recently, where Irving Shipbuilding clearly stated that the company will be accountable through an annual report on activities and on employment generation. Here are the details of that investment, Madam Speaker, which I'd like to talk about in relation to accountability and openness. Of that investment, up to $260 million is in terms of a forgivable loan for capital expenditures. Up to $44 million of that investment is in a repayable loan, which will help access to capital if needed. And all investments are secured by a first charge against real and personal property. The estimated increase in provincial tax revenue from those investments and from the work that will accrue over the next 19 years is $145 million per year. And that amounts, that's why I used the number before, Madam Speaker, to $2.8 billion. A 6% investment over 29 years on a return on investment of 15 to 20 times, Madam Speaker. Of the $260 million for capital expenditures, Madam Speaker, I'd like to say that the loan is based on a forgivable incentive based on capital costs and employment targets for Irving Shipbuilding and its subcontractors. To earn that forgiveness on the loan, Madam Speaker, Irving Shipbuilding is required to provide 4,000 direct jobs with Irving and Irving's direct subcontractors. That's what they're required to do in order to earn that level of forgiveness. I mentioned, too, that $44 million in investments have also been made. They were made, in fact, to help secure that contract in the first place. Had those not been made, it's perhaps possible to say, Madam Speaker, that this work would not be something we could look forward to in this province. This is an interest-bearing loan. It's repayable, fully repayable over 29 years. It includes human resource development, technology investment, and industrial development. And it involves the creation of a highly competitive, highly focused marine and ocean tech sector that I think in Nova Scotia we can benefit from as we go forward. And it involves also, this investment involves an $8 million commitment, a $250,000 a year commitment that Irving Shipbuilding Center of Excellence at Nova Scotia Community College. And that's designed to train a new generation of skilled tradespersons with particular emphasis on recruiting and training Aboriginals, visible minorities, and women. I think that's a very important investment, and it's one that we can monitor very clearly as we go forward. It also will help with an early stage apprenticeship program and a 10-year rolling workforce program. I want to say, because I know that I'm running out of time, Madam Speaker, that while much attention seems to be paid by the opposition toward these large business investments, there are many ways in which the government of Nova Scotia, in which this government is involved in investing in small and medium-sized businesses. We've lowered, Madam Speaker, the small business tax rate for the third time in as many years. We've created a program that gives new small businesses a tax holiday for the first 3 years of their existence, a typical tax relief that could be $200,000. We've developed a tax equity credit and a CEDIF investment program that allows the development of new businesses. We've created a film tax credit, and we've created a new digital media tax credit. These investments and many others like these, Madam Speaker, are designed to encourage entrepreneurship in this province. They're designed to encourage innovation. They're designed to encourage competitiveness. They're designed to encourage increased productivity. And they're designed to encourage Nova Scotians to begin thinking about their possibilities, to find ways to find new markets and new ways of doing business, not only here but around the world. And Madam Speaker, the combination of those small and medium-sized investments, along with what's happening with those larger contracts, are all part of a rejuvenation of the business climate in Nova Scotia, one which we think Nova Scotians can be proud of, one which we're absolutely committed to. We're absolutely committed to use these investments to secure a better future, a more transparent future, in fact, for all Nova Scotians now and tomorrow. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Here, good job.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, it's my pleasure to rise this evening to speak to the Bill 103, the Accountability and Economic Development Assistance Act. And Madam Speaker, we in the PC caucus are all about transparent and open government. But it's a shame that we have to bring an act forward in this House in order to get details from the government on the other side. Madam Speaker, I heard him talking about over there transparency in government, and today there was a number of questions asked here about contracts to the Irving Shipyard, Daewoo and Pictou. And Madam Speaker, frankly, we didn't get the answers we were looking for. They talk about privacy and the right time, and you're not allowed to let out trade secrets. Well, Madam Speaker, the questions we asked today about the shipyard contract, that contract has been awarded. And by awarding that contract, those trade secrets now I don't think would be trade secrets anymore. You know, we look for this bill for transparency, but there's no guarantee with this bill we're going to get any value out of the money that's being passed out by this government. You know, for decades, governments in this province have tried to create, save, and lower jobs by offering grants, loans, and forgivable loans, by giving out handouts. And Madam Speaker, over the last year and a half that I've been here, we've seen over $500 million handed out by this government with no guarantees for jobs. And nobody knows where that money's gone, a lot of it. We need to give the businesses of this province the tools they need to be prosperous here. We need to lower power rates, we need lower taxes, lower fuel rates, and we need to cut the red tape that's necessary for businesses to succeed. Well, Madam Speaker, this government has raised the art of giving handouts to a new level. They hand out money in loans and other giveaways, the same as Nova Scotians will be handing out candy to children this evening. To date, As I said, the NDP government has given out almost $500 million. That's billion, Madam Speaker, with a B. What could small businesses in this province do with that kind of money? With the right tools and that kind of money, small businesses in this province could flourish. What could we do with that money in the healthcare system? Madam Speaker, over the last 10 years, the healthcare system has gotten good at what it does. It does open heart surgeries, makes people survive, last longer, live longer. We've seen things like joint replacements that make people live longer, prosperous lives. But, Madam Speaker, those innovations in healthcare and education cost money. That $500 million could go a long way in the healthcare system. That $500 million is quite a treat for those companies, Madam Speaker. But rest assured, there's a trick as well. There always seems to be a trick. Today, productivity in Nova Scotia is 30% lower than the rest of Canada, and wages are stagnant. Actually, we're the second lowest in the country. The businesses that are surviving here are surviving in spite of the NDP's job-killing policies. 8,600 full-time jobs have disappeared in the last year, and we're hearing just the opposite. Ask the people in Cape Breton who had to leave to go out west to go to work. I have a next-door neighbour that doesn't get to see his children's Christmas concerts, his children's hockey games, because he has to go away to work. Real GDP lags behind the national average, and prices are up all over the province. And, Madam Speaker, we hear about the possibility of an election. The people here are voting with their feet. Since 2009, the population of Cape Breton has decreased by 3,300 people. That's 3,300 people that don't pay taxes in this province, that don't provide the revenue needed to run this province. So what do we have to do? We have to raise taxes. We know that more than 13,000 people have left our province for opportunities in Alberta, and that less than 10,000 of them have returned. That's what bailouts have done for us. Just ask companies like Bowater and the people who worked at Bowater. Madam Speaker, if bailouts ever work as an economic tool, they're sure not working now. This 103 bill is just a bill. It's a bill to make sure we can get transparency out of this government and to show all Nova Scotia where they're spending their money. Madam Speaker, the bill we're debating today doesn't say maybe we need to do things differently. Maybe we need to do things differently to create jobs in this province. It says we're going to build a database and a website to let people know what we're spending in this province and how much money they're actually taking from your taxpayers' money and handing out to big business. It puts into law procedures on how to document and the details of a failed system. It may accomplish something. A detailed reporting might convince the NDP that bailouts as a tool for economic development simply doesn't work. Putting those details on a public website, though, won't tell Nova Scotians anything they don't already know. Because we know bailouts don't work. We need to make the business community able to flourish through lower taxes, lower power rates, and less government red tape. So I guess this is a harmless enough bill. It doesn't do anything to create employment. But it will make the people of Nova Scotia aware where money's spent. It won't create a single job, and it won't prevent a single family from having to turn to a food bank to make ends meet. It won't lure Nova Scotians back to work from Alberta, and it won't increase our productivity. But it will tell us where our money is being spent and how it's being spent, and it may create a workplace where people will not just look for money for the sake of looking for it, that they actually need it. It would create a new website and generate a bunch of reports and forms, and may create more economic red tape. Mr. Speaker, Albert Einstein defied insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expected different results.
Continuing to provide handouts, even under provisions of this bill, and expecting jobs to appear certainly fits in Einstein's definition. It's time to stop this insanity. It's time to do things differently. It's time to make investments that create lasting quality jobs. It's time to invest in Nova Scotians to harness the skill and work ethic that already exists to transform our economy. This bill won't do that, but it will make sure the people of Nova Scotia know where our money is spent. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Now recognize the honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm certainly proud to have the opportunity to speak for a few minutes on our Bill 103, Accountability and Economic Assistance Act. It's certainly an important issue, and I think with the growing rate of skepticism among Nova Scotians and the people we represent, I think it's a bill that adds credibility and accountability to the way we spend taxpayers' dollars. And I do want to thank the member from Clayton Park, the member from Kings North, and the member from Cape Breton North for participating in this debate. I will honestly say that I'm certainly disappointed with some of the comments from the member from Kings North. I think that's completely unfair that in the scope of this debate and what we're talking about, that he would focus on the member of Cape Breton South, who has done an incredible amount of community service and public service to this Nova Scotia. And the member for Cape Breton South will certainly serve a lot longer than that member will. So, and the other rich part of that, Madam Speaker, is that the member was talking about accountability and how bad it was back many years ago. However, it's this government who, when in opposition, the Premier, the Deputy Premier, the former Minister of Finance, railed on about the slush fund they called the IEF. But this government renamed it to the Nova Scotia Jobs Fund and added $50 million to it. So there you go. For that's pretty rich to say that yeah, we're gonna clean it up. But the reality is, Madam Speaker, that people truly are, Nova Scotians truly are struggling, and I think that these are the type of bills and the type of actions we can take as representatives, as MLAs. People are struggling with power bills. They're struggling with education, whether that be post-secondary or families putting their kids through school. Obviously, health care is a concern for most Nova Scotia families. And again, we talk about it many times, but jobs. Jobs are a major issue in Cape Breton, Fort McMurray. Just prior to this session beginning, I lost my constituency assistant to Fort McMurray because he's going to make double the money, and that's the kind of thing you have to do. Luckily for him, at least he had employment here, and he had to go out west to pay the bills. But that's the reality we have. So in the backdrop of that, Nova Scotians, part of their daily routine is worry. They have to worry about how they make ends meet. They have to worry about how they heat their homes and keep the lights on. And in the backdrop of that, what they've seen is hundreds of millions of dollars going to big corporations in this province. So I think that's a concern, and I think that this bill speaks to that. Transparency in economic development assistance is a great idea. It's something that will help taxpayers understand where their money is going. It's being invested. The government will talk, and as past governments did, will talk about the investments they make and how it's for the betterment of the province. And I think that if you're applying new legislation and new rules to the funding organizations and the funding options we have in this province, it's not a bad thing. If you're talking about ERDT and the budgets that fall under there, if you're talking about NSBI, of course, the Jobs Fund, that was referred to as a slush fund by many of the government members when in opposition. But my question, and what I guess I would ask the government side, is why wouldn't we do this? Why wouldn't we consider this bill with regards to accountability for how we spend taxpayers' dollars? I think it's a fair question, and we don't have anything to hide. This isn't a confrontational bill. If the government doesn't have anything to hide on how these things were spent and how these expenditures were decided upon, then I think we can put it out there. And again, to echo some of the comments of my colleague from Clayton Park, DSME is a perfect example, and I speak about that many times because I happen to be, there's 52 of us in here, Madam Speaker, we're all accountable. my very first Economic Development Committee meeting, I truly noticed that there was an issue with the SME. And the members who were present at that committee, well, it's in Hansard, so you can read it for yourself, but the members who were there that day will back me on this. The SME came in, they gave a great presentation. Their facility is top-notch. The product they produce is excellent. That I agree with the minister and with the SME on that point, without question. The problem that existed in their 40-minute presentation when it was finished was they have no market for their product. So that, at the end of the day, is the fundamental of business. We talk about that all the time. You need revenues. When your revenues exceed your expenses, you make profit. That's how you employ people. That's how you develop. That's how you grow your business as entrepreneurs. We saw many of them in the gallery today that are doing just that with their own small business. They're using public funds to prop up some portion of their business, whether that be productivity, innovation, what have you. So I think that's an important thing to remember, and that's what we have to do with our funding. With DSME, we provided them with a check for $60 million, and the Premier, in his remarks, which I tabled, was that we would have 150 people working in the first year, followed by lead up to 500 eventually. We really haven't seen that. We haven't come close to that. There wasn't, there wasn't a stability with employment at the Trenton plant, and that's a problem. My concern with it, and the reason why I bring it up so often, I'm certainly no expert. I don't claim to be the person who's in charge of economic development for this province, but I think that the minister certainly should be one of those people that scrutinizes every single deal of this magnitude that we make. If we're spending 60 million tax dollars, the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism has to know that this is a good investment. Followed by that, he's got people in his department. There are the department, the deputy minister, who is a capable, competent person. The department, many of them whom I know, they're competent people. So there has to be a process. I can't believe that there wouldn't be a process for how we allocate $60 million to a corporation without knowing that there's got to be some level of security, some way that we can guarantee that $60 million is going to be well spent. So I think that if we were to adopt this bill, 103, I think this is a way to do that. If the SME was for public scrutiny, I think that obviously now there would be a lot of questions being asked by the public, but going in reverse and rewinding the clock, I think that you would see that there would be a requirement for the department, for the minister, for the bureaucrats to figure out, okay, we've got to have some degree of certainty here. This is a lot of money being invested, and we have to know that it's going to work. I'm sure that with the department and with the minister, we're not throwing, and the government will say this in reply, we're not throwing money at things without knowing where it's going to go. I hope that there's no actual possibility that that's the case. So I think that that's what we're kind of seeing here, and that's concerning. So if this stuff was public, basically we would know. And the bill talks about economic development assistance to provide, upon request, provide the details of economic development assistance, agreements signed with the province, the terms of conditions, and how the recipient is proceeding with regards to meeting any targets, timelines set out in the terms and conditions. I asked my colleagues, is that not the rules of the game? Isn't that exactly what we would want with taxpayers' dollars? We want to know that our money is protected to a certain extent. Certainly there are world economic factors. Certainly there are downturns. That's not new information to anybody. But within the confines of those realities, we've got to know that our money is relatively safe. One quick example I'll use is from my hometown, and it was an investment that was recent, and it was with respect to the Stream call center, Stream Global Services, who do a lot of call center work spread across the entire province. A real close friend of mine, Jeff Clemens, is a supervisor at Stream, and he does all the different sites they have across the world with some training and some upgrading and those types of things. This is a legitimate organization. Now, does it mean that you can't help out the Streams of the world if they're located in Glace Bay? No, but here's the reality. Our government gave, through NSBI, $2.1 million in payroll rebates. That is the way these things, as I've said many times, that is the way this money should be spent. NSBI made this decision. The NSBI board, through their payroll rebate program, looked at the specifications for Stream. They looked at the numbers and they approved it. Now, there's been no check. There's been no check. There's been no money change hands whatsoever because Stream has an obligation. The obligation is job targets. It's a job target. It's job guarantees. So by the end of 5 years, Stream has committed to adding X number of employees to its operations in Glace Bay, and then only at that time will they be given the $2.1 million on behalf of Nova Scotia taxpayers. That's how this should be done. If we did that with the $590 million we've spent and given to big corporations, we wouldn't be in this state now. We wouldn't be at a position where we've spent well over $500 million given the companies that we haven't seen any of the results. And it's not looking like we're going to. So very important points on that topic. And, you know, it's certainly a concern for all of us. I think that, you know, the point about the public and how interested they are, and it ties into my original point. People are skeptical. They want to know where the money's being spent. Again, and everybody feels it to a certain extent. Someone reading the Cape Breton Post or the Chronicle Herald or all the papers or any of the online media from Fort McMurray's got to be upset when they see these types of investments that go nowhere. It's very difficult for people to see that. They want to be here with their families. Again, I've done it. I've had the Alberta experience. I don't care how much money you make. It's not worth being away from your families for any amount of time. And that's the reality that we see here. So, you know, to publicize the rules of the game and to publicize where we're spending the money and how we spend it and what the details were, that's a pretty fair thing. So for us to publicize the details of the DSME or publicize the details of the Irving agreement online for everybody to see is not a novel idea. It's a fair idea. This is where it passes the public's accountability test. If they're so inclined, which thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people would be, to see those numbers and see what they look like, and saw what the progress were, what the deliverables were for the company and for the government, I think it would be able to allow people to see it. We do the same thing with our expenses. Any Nova Scotian can go online and look at every expenditure of the members in this room. Why not do that with their tax dollars for economic development? It's the same idea. You want to see it? Here it is. Here are the rules. Here's why the money was given. Here are the job guarantees. Why don't we look at that? So it makes a whole lot of sense. And again, I put that together myself. The member from Cape Breton West is very pleased with my words. You know, so again, today with the ministerial statement, I think that provides the focus where we have to be. Corporate welfare, these big handouts, the big checks, they don't work, and they won't work. And we've got to get back to, we all use the minister will use and the government will use the buzzwords and the jargon about productivity and innovation. Well, you're seeing it in play today. With the people who are in the gallery today, you're seeing that. You will be amazed, and I invite you to follow any of those companies, of the 46 companies, 46 SMEs that have received funding through the PIP voucher program. Follow that money. They'll let you know. You watch how far a small business can stretch $15,000. You go and witness for yourself how far a small business can stretch $25,000. And one of the natures of an entrepreneur is they want to be employers. They want to grow their business. They want to grow their ideas. So with that in mind, they need people. They need good people. Nova Scotia has good people, but we've got to give them the opportunities to work and have sustainable options to make sure that there's an economy here that's surviving. So very important things to remember, and I think that you know, you look around the province, it isn't corporations. That's the reality. That our economy is made up of small businesses. 98% of our economy, small businesses. So we think about the big operations and the big employers, but if you look around your own riding, you'll see that we've got all kinds of small businesses that, you know, fewer than 10 people. The definition is fewer than 100 people, but most are fewer than 10, and they survive the best way they know how. So I think that it's very important to support and foster that growth with small businesses. In closing on this bill, I think it's a great bill. I think that being accountable to the public and showing them how we spend and how we use their money is something that's a good idea. And if you want to diminish the skepticism in this province amongst taxpayers and voters and our Nova Scotian people, then that's a way to do it. And you know, I also hope that the minister will continue to follow those investments that use the experts to make decisions like NSBI. Use the private sector. This can't be a decision made at the cabinet level. Let's get the decisions in the hands of the experts. Publicize the information so people can see it. This is called accountability. So let's support this bill and let's show people how we spend their money in this province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order.